Dr. Weaver has joined us tonight. And so kind of on the leading on that kind of multi-species grazing scenario, Dr. Weaver is going to talk to us about how we can utilize some of these tools that Johnny's talked about to talk about how we can better manage our pastures with small ruminants and better manage our small ruminant grazers. And Dr. Weaver is an assistant professor of animal science and small ruminant extension specialist. He's established the NC Small Ruminant Improvement Program and is conducting a demonstration project currently co-grazing cattle and small ruminants on alternative forage species like ryegrass and crabgrass. And Dr. Weaver conducts educational programs on all aspects of management for small ruminants to help support the rapid growth of the sheep and goat population in North Carolina and the southeastern U.S. in general. So Dr. Weaver, I'm going to turn it over to you.
How does the screen look?
Looks good.
Am I sharing the right one?
Yep, sharing the right one.
Sounds good. Well, good evening, everyone, and hope to, over the next little bit here, share some considerations and thoughts on grazing small ruminants, both sheep and goats, and some things to take into account, but also, some opportunities that are out there as well. And so I want to start off with the positive, of course. And where would small ruminants, or where could small ruminants fit into a grazing system or to a farm? And I think one area that, especially here in North Carolina, and what I get a lot of phone calls about is, what I would call small acreage farming, kind of backyard operations, folks that are maybe moving out of the city and have the opportunity to own a few acres and are looking for some animals to put on that. And I think sheep or goats fit really well into that scenario. We can put a few sheep on a few acres and that can go quite well for us. Where, we certainly, if we only have a few acres, that might not even be able to manage, handle a single cow. And so sheep could work really well in that scenario. And so that, leads to this point as well, that with our small ruminants, we can get away with somewhat limited infrastructure and certainly lower initial investment costs. We don't necessarily need a livestock trailer to haul them around. We could put them in the back of a pickup truck. We don't need an extensive handling system necessarily. We could use a little corral and some gates and some panels and probably get done what we need to get done versus, what we might need to handle or treat cattle. And so there's certainly opportunity there. We can buy a few ewes at a fairly reasonable price. We can have a few acres without the huge investment cost for buying a large acreage operation. And we can get started grazing with small ruminants. We can kind of think of them as maybe a gateway into grazing livestock species and farming with livestock. And so I think there's lots of opportunities there. I get lots of phone calls for folks in a similar scenario as this. And so kind of exciting opportunity right now with them. Another opportunity that we're hearing a lot about is solar grazing. And, the increase in acreage going into solar is certainly something to take notice of, not only here in North Carolina, but across the Southeast, even in the Midwest and other parts of the country. There's quite a sizable increase in the number of acres of solar over the last few years, and projecting forward over the next 10, 20 years, there's going to be a lot more. And so every one of those acres that's put into solar panels, we're somewhat restricted in what we can do with that grass and that forage, that vegetation under the panels. And sheep are one of the few species that can utilize that. Goats don't work really, very well at all because they perch on the panels, and that's not good for capturing solar energy. And so sheep work very well in that scenario. Cattle, maybe a little bit hard on the panels, so we need to be aware of that. So sheep really fit in that environment quite well, and I think they're gaining popularity there and increasing interest in that. And so certainly, if you got some solar operations going in close by, that's something to look into, and some opportunity there to. You don't necessarily need to own the land. You could certainly raise sheep on that solar property. And so if you want more information about that, let us know. Johnny is a great resource for that, as well as he's been doing that on the property that him and Sharon have been managing for a number of years now. Vineyard grazing is an idea that I heard of here relatively recently. And I think, kind of building off, it's kind of the same principles as solar grazing. If people are realizing that, the vegetation that grows in a vineyard, instead of mowing that, we can use sheep. And the sheep are producing a fertilizer out the back end. At the same time, they're managing the vegetation, and it's really the best of both worlds. And so there's increasing interest there, especially in the western regions of the United States. And so that's something to be aware of and consider. And also, speaking of the West, small ruminants are being used more and more for fire management, fire control, taking care of some of that excess vegetation that may turn into fuel for forest fires, wildfires. And so they're being used in that way and can be quite effective there. And then just in general, in terms of increasing land productivity and diversity, and maybe you're already a cattle producer, or maybe you raise other species of livestock, maybe you run other types of agricultural enterprises, and small ruminants may fit in quite well in terms of just adding diversity and opportunity. Small ruminant markets, they're in the period post-COVID were quite good. They've settled down just a little bit now, but there's still some opportunity to certainly be profitable in the small ruminant business. And so maybe adding in that diversity and not only marketing, but also in ecology, and the system that we have, and what can small ruminants bring to the picture to add to maybe a cattle operation or even a row crop operation. Where do they fit in? And certainly we need to consider that as well. So speaking of multi-species systems, especially as it relates to cattle, this quote, many of you may have already heard, for every cow your operation runs, you can add one ewe and never miss the grass. And the idea behind this, and this quote has been around for some time now, is really the differences in grazing behavior and selectivity between our small ruminants and our cattle. And because they're going to choose different parts of the pasture and have different preferences, we can combine sheep with cattle at a 1-to-1 ratio and really not change anything else about what we're doing. We already own the acreage. We have the land mass. We're managing the land mass. If we've got 20 cows, why not add 20 ewes to that and increase the total productivity from that land mass, manage risk better by having multiple species, and also bringing the diversity in terms of animal species to our grazing system and the pasture system that we have. And so some research at Texas A&M showed a 24% improvement in total farm meat production where sheep were added to a cattle operation. So again, we have the land mass already. We're already paying for that land, and to take care of that land, why not improve the productivity of it? And then, as I've touched on already, opportunities for marketing and risk management. We avoid putting all of our eggs in one basket. The sheep market may be good, cattle market may not be so great. And so we can take advantage of having some small ruminants. On the flip side, maybe the small ruminant markets aren't great, but the cattle markets are good. And so we can, take advantage of the fact that we have some cattle to sell, and we don't need to be so reliant on the small ruminants. And so from that standpoint, and also just general cash flow, we're going to, potentially market our small ruminants at different times of the year than we would maybe our cattle or our other commodities that we're producing. And so we have, more consistent cash flow throughout the year, which could also be of benefit to our operations. So I wanted to jump into grazing behavior. And as Dr. Siciliano talked about with the horses, this is a really good place to start, and understanding how our animals graze, what they prefer. It helps us understand how to manage them and how to work with them in that system. And so in really broad terms, sheep graze. So sheep reach down for our forages off the ground, and goats, if given the opportunity, goats browse. So goats are going to reach up. They reach up into the canopy. They reach up and they're going to eat, maybe more of those woody plants, those leaves and brush. And that's really what they prefer. And that's how they've evolved over time. And so we think about just natural resistance to things like parasites between our sheep and goat species. Sheep tend to be, as a whole species, tend to be a little bit more parasite resistant than our goats, because sheep have evolved in a system where they're reaching down, eating off the ground, where there are more parasites and they're exposed to more. And the ones that have made it through are the ones that are able to handle that infection, where our goats really prefer to browse. And if we keep them in that browsing type system, which they're really well suited for, there's not very many parasites up in that canopy. And so then we take those goats and we force them into maybe more of a grazing scenario where they're eating off the ground, and they're going to be exposed to more of those parasites. We could potentially run into some challenges there. And so that's something to be aware of and cognizant of with goats. But either way, when we think about sheep or goats, they are more selective in terms of their grazing behavior. relative to cattle. And this has to do with their bite size. Dr. Poor showed a picture in a couple webinars ago of different skulls from our different grazing livestock species. And if you just look at the width of the mouth and mouth size and bite size and those differences between our sheep and our goats relative to our cattle, you can kind of conceptualize and picture how those small ruminants are certainly going to be or could be more selective, and they can get in and pick those specific parts of the pasture that they are interested in eating. And I have a great example of that here. This was some pictures from some pastures last summer, and we had some fox. We intended to grow some crabgrass, and we did, but we also got some foxtail contamination in there. And it was interesting to look at the preferences between our sheep and our cattle. So this was the same pasture, and we had a section allocated to sheep and a section allocated to cattle, and actually another section with sheep and cattle. And so we were out there one day, and Johnny actually pointed out, look at the differences in what those sheep are eating on the foxtail plants compared to the cattle. And if we look at the sheep plants there on the left, you can see the sheep have stripped all the leaves off. They left the stem there, but the leaves are missing, largely missing. Where the cattle just really largely just ignore the entire plant in and of itself. So they're really they're not using the foxtail at all. They don't really like the foxtail. They preferred the crabgrass. And so they left the foxtail alone. They didn't eat any part of the plant. They just left it all there. Where our sheep, while they don't seem to like the stem, they're at least taking advantage of the leaves that are there and can utilize that as a nutrient source. This picture here actually was taken a few days ago in kind of a mixed grass pasture. We've got some fescue and orchard grass out here, as well as some vetch and some clover. And this picture was taken shortly after we turned ewes in to start grazing this pasture. And I noticed all the ewes, they were in a ryegrass pasture before this. And so we turned them into, kind of a more diverse pasture. And they went straight for the vetch plants. And they went in there, and even the lambs, to some extent, went over, they found the vetch, and they just devoured those vetch plants and really preferred and selected those, over the fescue or orchard grass that were around them. And so I thought that was, a good example of how they can, they'll go in and pick and choose, exactly what they want to eat at a given time period. And they'll sometimes choose those plants that are, a little bit more nutrient dense as well. This picture, another good example here. So this was one of our ryegrass pastures, and this pasture did have some contamination with some white ball mustard. And so you'll see that with the little white flowers there. But there's some ryegrass mixed in there. And so I walked over, and this ewe had her head down there, and what it would appear is that she's nibbling on, maybe interested in that mustard plant. Then a moment later, snap this picture, and she picks her head up, and that mouth is just full of ryegrass. And so again, I think this is a good example of how they can be really selective. They go in and you can't even hardly tell there's ryegrass mixed in there, but she was able to go down in there and find the ryegrass that she really wanted and pick that out from the rest of the plants that were in there, and choose that ryegrass and consume that. I really questioned, I was like, are these ewes going to eat that white ball mustard? Do they like it? And so kept watching this ewe, just see what she would do. And a few minutes later, sure enough, she did actually go down and she bit off, one of the stems there of that plant. And you can see that if you look closely here, there's that stem with little white flower hanging out of her mouth. So they did eat that plant as well. Their first choice seemed to be, in just, observations I made, probably going for the ryegrass, but they did eat some of that white ball mustard. And it was interesting, as they grazed through this field, the first allocation for about 2-3 days, they didn't really eat much of it at all. The second allocation, I noticed they did eat a little bit more of it. And by the fourth, fifth allocation within this pasture, they were eating quite a bit of it that was out there. So it's almost like they learned, they tried it out, and over time they kind of learned and adapted and started eating more of it. And they seem to like it all right, or at least want to eat it. So our small ruminants, they can be selective. They're going to go in there and kind of pick and choose what they want. And so we need to be aware of that and think about how we're going to manage them in a way that we can control that behavior, to the extent that we want to. kind of switching gears here and thinking about how we can pair up our cool season forage production with our livestock. Sheep probably, and goats too, probably fit the growth curve of our cool season forages, maybe the best of all of our grazing species. And as an example of that, we've got our cool season growth curve here. In this example, we've got tall fescue. So the solid line would be our tall fescue growth curve. We get that spring flush, and then we get, that second hump there in the fall months. And then the dotted line represents stockpile tall fescue. And so small ruminants naturally want to breed in the fall. That's when they're the most fertile. And so we can take advantage of the fact that we have some high quality stockpiled forage in the fall months to breed our ewes on. And so we can use some of those principles of adaptive grazing and what Johnny talked about just a short while ago. We can exclude those livestock from a given area. We can let that stockpile and accumulate and have that available for that later fall and winter grazing. And that forage, especially fescue, is able to maintain that quality quite well. And so we have some high quality forage, high plane of nutrition that we can put those ewes on. We can do what we call flushing, and we can increase their plane of nutrition. And that's going to lead to increased ovulation rate and an increased lambing percentage. So we can get them bred on some pretty high quality stuff there, on the later fall months. And they're going to be more fertile naturally anyway. And then they're pregnant over the winter months. And a ewe in early gestation, mid gestation, her requirements are still relatively low. And so if we get a little bit low, or maybe we run out of stockpile, maybe we have to put them on some hay for a little bit, put them in a dry lot. Even if we don't have the highest quality forages available to them, they're probably going to get by, especially in early and mid gestation. Now we get into late gestation, and nutrition becomes a lot more important. We certainly want to increase the amount of energy and protein in their diet so that we avoid issues like pregnancy toxemia. But if we time that appropriately, they should be entering late gestation as we start to get that spring forage growth. And so here in North Carolina, as we get into the early parts of March and mid-March, we've got that forage really starting to come on, and it's going to be fairly high in quality. And we can have those ewes, if they're in late gestation, that kind of time period, we can pair that up and it can work pretty well. As their nutrient requirements are increasing, we have, increased supply of high quality forage. And then we can lamb and go through lactation when we have an abundance of cool season forages in the spring. These forages are typically pretty good in quality and available in a large supply. And so when those ewes have their highest demands and are going to eat the most and also need the highest quality in their diet, we can pair that up when we have the forages to do so. And then come summer months, we just have open ewes. And so, maybe if we just have much cool season pastures and things get tough in the middle part of the summer when it gets really hot, maybe it gets dry on us, which, certainly happens and has happened here in recent times. Maybe we get a little bit low on our forage supply in the middle part of the summer. We've got open ewes that are at maintenance. They're not pregnant. And those ewes you can rough through on some pretty tough environments. And so we can get them by through those summer months until we have the return of those cool season forages come fall. So our small ruminants work really well in this kind of cool season perennial type pasture program, and can fit in really well. And we can match up our management system, our production system with the availability of high quality forage. And then, maybe we want to better manage, that summer slump, that period in the middle part of the summer when our cool season forages aren't as active. And maybe we could put something in like crabgrass. Crabgrass is a warm season annual, but it reseeds itself really well. And so in some cases, it kind of acts like a perennial. And so, this picture here was taken on our farm on campus in mid-July. We got a fescue pasture there on the left, crabgrass planted on the right. Neither one of these pastures had been grazed in a month. And you can just see, the visible difference in yield that's available there. And we were able to graze crabgrass for about 60 days last summer. And really it got us through quite well through the middle part of the summer before we could get back on the fescue. And so that's one opportunity as well. Going back to, just some general principles of grazing management, and this has been touched on many times, and just wanted to show a couple examples here as it relates to sheep. To take half, leave half is a pretty good approach. Go in, graze half of what's there, maybe start when that forage is 8, 10, 12 inches tall, graze it down to 4, 6 inches, and leave that residual there. And the more you leave there, the more leaf mass that's there, the faster that plant can regrow, and the quicker you can come back and graze it. And the longevity of your stand, the health of that forage is going to improve as well. Especially, think back to all those pictures you've seen over the last couple of weeks of root mass and the impact that overgrazing can have on the roots and what's going on underneath the surface of the soil. And so the bottom left image here, that's crabgrass, our crabgrass pastures last summer, and those ewes grazing that. The top picture was taken about 3 weeks ago on our ryegrass pastures. These are about 2 to 3 day grazes, these allocations that we have going, and so respect that minimum grazing height. If it's fescue, 3 to 4 inches. Our other cool seasons, about 3 inches, 4 inches as well. Our warm season grasses we can get a little bit closer with, but just keep those things in mind and make sure you're not overgrazing. Not only is it good for the forages and your ability to come back and regraze, but it's also good from a parasite management standpoint. We'll talk about that here in just a few slides. Give your pastures some time to rest. And again, I'm repeating a lot of the topics that Dr. Siciliano talked about and Johnny's talked about, Dr. Poor and Dr. Harmon have all talked about. Give that pasture time to rest. Here's an example. This was a multi-species grazing demonstration, and we had some goats in with some heifers. And the picture on the right is July 26th of last summer when we took those animals off that pasture. And the next picture to the right there is exactly 1 month later when we were able to come back in and start grazing again. And I know the shadow makes it a little bit hard to see, but hopefully you can see the increase in forage biomass that's there just after 1 month of allowing that pasture to rest. And all it takes is maybe a strand of poly wire or a strand of some poly net to exclude those animals, and we can let that pasture regrow and we can come back and graze it. Had we not done that, we'd have had to go somewhere else and graze something else. But because we did that and allowed that to rest, that bought us that much more time grazing instead of maybe feeding something else. So when we start thinking about comparing animal nutrient requirements to the supply of forage available, and again, I think this was touched on, in maybe the first webinar a couple weeks ago. We thought about, Johnny spoke about determining animal demand. And we can really think about this in terms of supply and demand. What's demanded by the animal in terms of their nutrient requirements, and what's supplied by our forages and the nutrient quality and mass that's out there. And so this was our crabgrass, some data from our crabgrass project last summer. Total digestible nutrients, that represents the energy that's in our forages. So we forage samples at 3 different time points here in mid-July, mid-August, and the first part of September. And you can see that crabgrass is actually pretty high quality there in mid-July. TDN up over mid-70s. So pretty good stuff there. It did decline and was in mid to upper 60s there the second half of the summer. We start thinking about how that compares to the nutrient requirements and the demands of our animals. I'll just reference things to cows because that's what a lot of us are familiar with. So a lactating cow requires about 60% TDN in her diet. A lactating ewe, on the other hand, requires about 65% TDN in her diet. So those ewes are going to require a denser, a more concentrated energy source. We look at the growing animals. A 700-pound steer is there about 67, 68% TDN. And if we look at a growing lamb, they're all the way up there at 76%. So a growing lamb requires a very, very energy dense feed source. And so if we look and compare that to our crabgrass, for whether it be a lactating ewe or a lactating cow, or even a growing steer there in the mid part of the summer, that crabgrass had sufficient energy to meet their needs. But even with our, the high quality of that crabgrass in the early part of the summer, it was not sufficient to support a relatively fast growing lamb. So we need to be aware of that. One of the shortfalls on this was probably protein, which was a little bit lower. It was below 10 for the entire summer. We compare that to the requirements and demand of our animals. Lactating cow there is, just over 10, 10.5, 11% or so on crude protein requirements. Our lactating ewe is up at 15%. Our growing steer is there at about 11 to 12%. And our growing lamb is about 14.5%. And so, for none of these classes of animals, species of animals, would that crabgrass be sufficient? We did not apply any nitrogen to this crabgrass. And so maybe had we done that, maybe that would have increased the protein there and helped us out a little bit, but something to be aware of. So, it was certainly a good energy source there. We grazed a bunch of open ewes. And so, their requirements are even lower than what's provided here. And so they did pretty well on it. But, certainly if we had those more demanding classes of animals, we need to be cognizant, especially on the protein side of things. And so in general, kind of one of the takeaways here is, small ruminants require a greater concentration of nutrients in their diet compared to cattle. They require a more nutrient dense diet compared to cattle, and we need to be cognizant of that if we're going to add in small ruminants to our grazing system. Touch on the ryegrass here, and these graphs should look pretty similar. Top grass there is total adjustable nutrients. Our ryegrass, we tested our ryegrass as well as that mixed grass, kind of fescue, orchard grass, vetch pasture there that I showed an image of earlier. We tested these in early March. We actually tested these last week. I'm still waiting for the forage analysis results to come back, so I'm not able to share those with you. But these pastures tested pretty good. They're in early March. They were 78, 79% TDN. So if we compare that to our classes of animals, again, lactating cow would be all the way down there. Lactating ewes, about 67 or 64, 64, 65. Our steer there is about 67.5. And our growing lamb is there at 76. And so for all of these classes of animals,